these likely massive protests tomorrow are coming at a time of pronounced weakness for him and his administration. And I think the mainstream media doesn't always talk about this. I think one of Trump's great geniuses, one of the things he's actually truly great at, is getting the media to cover things he wants them to cover. Even if he can't always get the kinds of coverage that he wants, he can almost always get the topics covered that he wants. And so because of that, I think some of the ways in which he is at a profound moment of weakness in his presidency have just kind of slipped by and not made the headlines. But I think if you're being real and you take a wide aperture look at what's going on with him right now, that's the pretty obvious bottom line. I mean, here's just one piece of that. So today's Friday. Usually every Thursday, we get the jobs numbers, right? We get the jobless claims data. That usually happens every Thursday. On the first Friday of every month, we're supposed to get the data on the number of new jobs created in unemployment. We're not getting that now, apparently because of the government shutdown. The first Friday after the shutdown started, they reportedly had that jobs report ready to go and they could have released it, but they didn't for some reason. That's not exactly a sign of strength. Private sector job indicators around the same time, payroll data and stuff, indicated that the jobs numbers right at the start of the shutdown might actually be horrific numbers. And so who knows, maybe that influenced Trump's decision about not allowing that data to be released, even though they had it right at the start of the shutdown. We'll never know, right? Before the shutdown, Trump fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics when the jobs numbers started looking really bad. Well, now Trump has quietly withdrawn the nomination of the guy he picked to replace the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. He's withdrawn that nomination and nobody new has been named for that job. Trump has also quietly just withdrawn his nomination for the person he wanted to put in charge of veterans benefits at the VA. That nomination has been pulled as well. Trump has also quietly just withdrawn his nominee for a senior oversight position at HUD. That nomination's been pulled as well. Trump has quietly just withdrawn his nomination for the person he wanted to be ambassador to Serbia. That's gone now, too. Trump has quietly just withdrawn his nomination to lead the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. That nominee then posted online about Trump donors telling him to, quote, rectify, meaning spike, a CFTC case against them, against the Trump donors. He says he refused to do that, and he says that's why his nomination was pulled. Trump's deputy White House chief of staff just quit and left. The chief of staff to Attorney General Pam Bondi just quit and left. They just removed the 25-year-old Fox News producer. They put in charge of the commission that's supposed to run the America's 250th birthday celebration. How come all these people are being pulled? How come all these nominations, controversial for one reason or another, are all just being yanked? Can't stand the bad press? Can no longer take it, political capital-wise, to have unpopular or problematic nominees pushed through the news cycle? You don't feel strong enough to bear that brunt anymore the way you used to? Today, this was a large protest on the lawn at the main campus quad at the University of Virginia. This is the protest there today with students and faculty and staff telling the UVA administration that they should refuse to sign this deal with the devil compact with the Trump administration to supposedly get special preferences in federal funding if you agree to Trump's ideological strictures on your academic freedom. This was the protest today at UVA, telling the UVA administration, don't you dare, do not sell us out, don't you sign that thing. This was today. And then this, tonight, was the statement, in fact, released by UVA's president, saying, okay, we're not doing it. We have told the Trump administration no. Remember when it was just Harvard standing up and all the other universities were too intimidated to say no? Well, now even the ones that caved before or that signed deals before with Trump, places like Brown University, even those schools have now learned that maybe signing deals with Trump is not a good idea. trying to appease him, trying to stay on his good side is folly. It just shows weakness. It invites him to come back and bully you some more. And so in quick succession, we have seen MIT and Brown and Penn and USC and now UVA as well. They've all told the Trump White House, no, we're not doing it. We're not signing on to your little compact to restrict our academic freedom and our ideological freedom of movement in order to try to keep you happy. No, we are not doing it. We have learned our lesson. Forget it. The Pentagon press corps, all the real reporters at the Pentagon, even the ones from Fox News, this week all walked out in unison, telling Trump, no, we're not going to do it either. We're not going to agree to just write down what you tell us instead of doing actual journalism. No, we are not doing it. They walked out in unison, en masse. They told him no. In Chicago, we're seeing spontaneous protests in every city, neighborhood, and in every suburb against Trump's apparently untrained, totally out of their depth paramilitary dress-up immigration agents who, among other things, are now regularly tear-gassing Chicago police officers. A federal judge has now ordered Trump's federal agents from the bench, quote, you can't deploy tear gas. You can't use flashbang grenades. You can't drive a car through a crowd. You can't shoot them in the head with pepper balls. The judge has ordered that Trump's federal agents in Chicago must not only change their ridiculous tactics, they must now wear body cameras, and they must have them turned on. A different federal judge had ruled that the National Guard cannot be deployed to Illinois. That ruling has now been upheld by a unanimous 3-judge panel of a federal appeals court. In Washington, D.C., where Trump installed yet another Fox News host to be U.S. attorney in that city, they tried once, they tried twice, they tried 3 times to convince a grand jury to bring a felony criminal indictment against one D.C. resident who was part of a protest there. All 3 times, the grand jury refused to move ahead with those felony charges. Jeanine Pirro's office then instead finally charged this young woman with a misdemeanor for which they put her on trial. That was yesterday. The jury laughed them out of the courtroom and acquitted her yesterday afternoon after about a nanosecond of deliberation. As Trump continues to personally order up criminal indictments against people he doesn't like, James Comey, Tish James, now John Bolton. Tonight, 2 more veteran prosecutors have reportedly been fired after refusing to bring what they believe to be a baseless prosecution against New York Attorney General Tish James. Yesterday, in that district, in the Eastern District of Virginia, a judge who is Trump appointed took a moment, a dramatic moment from the bench at the conclusion of a big national security case, took a moment from the bench to praise James Comey's son-in-law, who recently resigned as a prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia when that office charged his father-in-law, James Comey. The judge praised the prosecutor from the bench, saying, quote, how saddened he was that I will, quote, not have the privilege of him appearing in my courtroom again. He said he was disheartened to know that the Department of Justice and our nation will be deprived of his obvious talents and integrity going forward. He said, quote, lawyers who stand up for the rule of law provide an essential contribution to the cause of freedom. The judge said, quote, what makes our country great is that we are a free country. And our great nation serves as a beacon for freedom around the world. But freedom and the rule of law necessarily go hand in hand. You cannot have one without the other. Again, a Trump-appointed judge making very pointed comments from the bench at the conclusion of a national security case in EDVA. That comes in the wake of another Trump-appointed federal judge issuing just a rip-snorting opinion, not only blocking Trump from sending troops to Portland, but really eviscerating him in very sharp language for even having the temerity to try it. New AP polling has Donald Trump 24 points underwater in his job approval rating.
This afternoon makes it 3 indictments of Donald Trump's critics in a little over 3 weeks, because today John Bolton, the former national security advisor to Donald Trump, surrendered himself to law enforcement and submitted a not guilty plea to a federal indictment. There are 18 counts in all. They have to do with the retention and transmission of national defense information, specifically diary notes shared by email with two people who did not have the proper security clearance. Those notes were regarding his day-to-day activities as national security advisor to Donald Trump. In addition to travel restrictions put into place on John Bolton today, he also faces up to 10 years in custody and a $250,000 fine per count, meaning if convicted, he could possibly spend the rest of his life in prison. His next court date is November 21st. As his case and his defense come into focus, so too do some of the similarities and differences between this particular indictment and prosecution and those of Donald Trump's other political targets. The comparison is pretty simple. This is yet again an example of the Justice Department's unique and formidable singular power relay trained on one of Donald Trump's critics, and yet there are distinctions as well. Consider that where the cases against Jim Comey and Tish James were brought by a political appointee, the indictment against John Bolton is being handled by career prosecutors, at least at this point. In other words, there appears to be more there in the Bolton instance. This is where the nuance comes into play, though, because John Bolton was not exactly the first person in American history to ever see or handle classified information prior to writing a book about his time in government. So he certainly could not have been the first and only person to submit manuscripts as part of his publication review designed to then remove the sensitive passages. In fact, the only reason we're even aware that Bolton shared this information is because while Joe Biden was president, U.S. intelligence covertly penetrated the systems of Iran and discovered that that country, Iran, had hacked one of the email accounts associated with John Bolton. In response to the indictment, Bolton released a statement that reads in part, quote, "When my email was hacked in 2021, the FBI was made fully aware. In 4 years of the prior administration after these reviews, no charges were ever filed. Then came Trump 2, who embodies what Joseph Stalin's head of secret police once said, quote, 'You show me the man and I'll show you the crime.' These charges are not just about his focus on me or my diaries, but his intensive effort to intimidate his opponents, to ensure that he alone determines what is said about his conduct. Dissent and disagreement are foundational to America's constitutional system and vitally important to our freedom. I look forward to the fight to defend my lawful conduct and to expose his abuse of power." Now, if only John Bolton had shared sensitive information over Signal, using the Signal app, or stored boxes of it in his Mar-a-Lago bathroom, maybe he too would be a free man. But not likely. It's where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. With me at the table, New York Times investigative reporter Mike Schmidt and former Criminal Division Deputy Chief at SDNY, MSNBC legal analyst, host of a new YouTube show, Courtside, Christy Greenberg is back. Also joining us, publisher of The Bulwark, host of the Focus Group podcast, spokesperson for Home of the Brave, Sarah Longwell, is back with us. Sarah, it's great to have you back. I want to start with you and ask you if this is sinking in. I've seen some of the poll numbers. Americans overwhelmingly disapprove of using the justice system to prosecute one's enemies. But what isn't clear to me is how many people are aware of this pattern and practice.
Yeah, look, I would love to say that the American people are incensed about this, but the fact is the number one thing we are hearing from voters in terms of what they are frustrated about really is the economy, prices, and what they see as Donald Trump's failure to focus on those things and instead focus on things like prosecuting his enemies. And so it's not that they're not aware of it. It's just that they're like, Trump is doing this thing where it's about, you know, making himself happy and going after people he doesn't like instead of focusing on the things that I care about. But what they don't do necessarily, unless, I mean, Democrats certainly do, but sort of swing voters, voters who aren't paying as much attention, certainly MAGA voters, they are less interested in sort of the institutional problems of Trump weaponizing the Justice Department, going after his enemies, and they are more focused on just the fact that Donald Trump doesn't seem to be doing anything for them. It's all about him.
Sarah, let me ask you this. We had so many conversations, I think, sharing exasperation that some of these folks sat on the sidelines. John Bolton wasn't one of them. I mean, he jumped into the arena and harshly criticized Donald Trump when all the generals described him as, quote, fascistic to the core and meeting the, quote, technical definition of a dictator. John Bolton, when asked about it, said essentially Trump is too stupid to be a fascist. He didn't, though, go to the next logical step, in my view, and endorse Kamala Harris or Joe Biden before him, as Liz Cheney did. But what do you make of these people without sort of natural constituencies? Tish James has sort of the thunderous, palpable roar of New York behind her, of the Democratic Party behind her. Jim Comey and Bolton are sort of constituentless. They don't have a constituency or really stakeholders. Do you think that makes any difference? Does that change how people see these indictments?
They do live in the sour spot of public opinion to some degree. I do think, however, people, as best as I can tell, seem to feel somewhat differently about James Comey than they do about John Bolton. And I think that the reason is that even though, a lot of people look back at 2016 and they've got very negative feelings about some of the decisions that James Comey made in those moments, I also think that people have sort of softened on him. They sort of feel like, maybe he made bad choices with imperfect information, but what Trump is doing going after him is wrong. Also, I think for people who are paying closer attention, they know that his daughter was one of the people that was fired for trying to just uphold the law. And I think that the way that he has pushed back specifically has sort of galvanized people. I mean, I've done a lot of live shows and a lot of focus groups since the Comey indictment came down. There's a lot of sympathy for Comey. I think people feel slightly differently about John Bolton, in part because there's a strong memory of the fact that specifically around this book, when he was writing it, he chose to write the book instead of testify against Donald Trump when people felt like it would really matter. And so there's some frustration there. I will say one thing that the public is aware of, I think pretty clearly, is that John Bolton is being prosecuted for the very thing that Donald Trump was doing himself, which was keeping all of these documents, sharing them with people, showing them around when he had all of those documents at Mar-a-Lago. And so I do think people, though, even if they are not directly sympathetic exactly to John Bolton, they do think that it is unfair for John Bolton to be prosecuted for a crime and go to jail for 10 years for something that Donald Trump absolutely did in plain sight, tried to cover up, and then was reelected president subsequently.
The Comey piece from Sarah is interesting, Mike, in that, and I know you've been covering him longer than just about anybody, the attack against Comey extends to his daughter, Maureen Comey, who handled the Epstein case, but also his son-in-law, who was pushed out of that Eastern District of Virginia. And a judge who was appointed by Donald Trump in his first term lamented the departure and the sort of going after, targeting, not just of Comey, but all of the sort of ripple effects of his, that Donald Trump's political war with Jim Comey and the family. Let me read this to you. This is from a Trump-appointed judge. Although I will not comment on why Mr. Edwards, who is Jim Comey's son-in-law, is no longer employed by the Department of Justice, I do want to say how sad I am that I will not have the privilege of him appearing in my courtroom again. I'm even more disheartened to know that the Department of Justice and our nation will be deprived of his obvious talents and integrity going forward, because his work has been truly exceptional in every way, as has been all the lawyers involved in this case. I leave you with a quote from our former great president, Dwight Eisenhower, who saved the world from authoritarianism when he served as the leader of the Allied forces in World War II. Quote, freedom has its life in the hearts, the actions, the spirit of men, and so it must be daily earned and refreshed. Else, like a flower cut from its life-giving roots, it will wither and die. The whole Virginia story, the war on Comey, the purging of the U.S. attorney picked by Team Trump, Eric Siebert, the pushing out and the punishing of Comey's son-in-law seems to still be reverberating in this district.
Yeah, I think that something we've seen, and you see it particularly in the James case, is that the powers of the Justice Department are being used here in ways that are not about winning cases. So for like all of human history, for the sake of this discussion, my understanding was that the Justice Department was about bringing cases that they could win, that they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt, and then could survive an appeal. It seems like that doesn't really matter as much to the department, especially if you look at like the James case. In a sense, there are different aspects to what's going on here in the ways that the specter of criminality is used. Trump understands better than anyone else what I call the specter of criminality. He used it against Hillary Clinton during the 2016 campaign. He understood it to the core, to his bones, in 2017, in 2018, in 2019, when he had the special counsel's investigation and had the SDNY investigation into Michael Cohen. He certainly learned about it 4 times when he was indicted, when he was out of office and had to sit through a criminal trial. And then he pledged vengeance when he came back. So in terms of what this retribution campaign means, or what this vengeance campaign means and what it is, and, you know, how it's going to play out, it does seem like they care less about winning than they do about using the powers of the department to hurt others. And then that's just remarkable.
A new court loss for President Trump. Another court now stopping his bid to try to seize powers and put troops in the streets, something that has been, of course, controversial with a lot of protest. Trump has been trying to claim the power to deploy troops, and he's done it under the authority of what he calls rebellion. That's even when governors oppose using their state's guard that way, and even when there's no apparent rebellion, not one that anyone has seen. Well, judges have rebuffed Trump, and this powerful appeals court is blocking Trump's plot to put the troops in Chicago as unlawful. The court telling Trump that he's wrong, he does not have this power. And when it comes to this factual question that I just mentioned of, well, does the rebellion clause kick in? This appeals court ruling that democracy and political opposition are not an organized rebellion, reinforcing Trump's prior losses in the lower courts on the abuse of this same type of power. So Trump is losing on the law. This is not rebellion, the court says. Now, the language and precedent are pretty clear there. So Trump's only legal path to still trying to get his troops back into the streets here would be to get the Supreme Court to bail him out, something they have done on other issues. So he's asking the high court to overrule this loss. Justice Barrett today did not order the type of stay that Trump wants. So instead, no emergency immediate action today, which means he is still on the losing side of this. Illinois officials can respond by the end of the day, Monday, the beginning of next week. If you are keeping track, this is another loss where Donald Trump has, of course, some agents and some troops in the streets and some level of concern, fear, and even among some people, a kind of despondent feeling that, well, I guess he's getting away with it all. And on some things he is, but on this one, he's not. And so the political strategy of flooding the zone or taking the L's and hoping people just focus on other things is being tested, because it turns out when people fight and the law holds, you can't just have endless troops in the streets and an endless sort of military vibe in our country. That's still not America. Now, then there's Trump's DOJ, which continues to grind through these indictments. They've now turned this week to a Trump official from the first term. And today, John Bolton, we saw walking in to court where he pled not guilty to these charges of mishandling classified documents stemming from the security access he had in Donald Trump's first term. The wider context is that Trump has been using the DOJ to go after individuals who all have one thing in common. I mean, here you have people from different parties, from different parts of the country, state and federal officials. What do they all have in common? They are currently on Donald Trump's enemies list. And while there are some differences in the Bolton case, and we covered that when the news broke, when you look at the focus on what are factually older incidents, you have to get your calendar out and go back years to find out what they're talking about with Comey and Bolton. Well, that adds to the skepticism, the questions raised about whether the Bolton case is also, even if the facts are stronger, part of Trump's vendetta. So here, take one outside view from Rupert Murdoch's media empire, which, as you know, includes Fox News, Wall Street Journal, and they've backed many Trump policies. And yet, in the Journal here, they're saying if you work for the president and he sours on you and you criticize him, you're not safe. There's little doubt Rupert Murdoch's journal notes that the underlying motivation for the Bolton prosecution is retribution. The calls are now coming from inside this conservative alliance. Fox News, you might say, is not as strong as the Journal on that issue about what the Journal says is Donald Trump's unlawful prosecution of foes. But Fox News this week also joined all other major news outlets in resisting the Pentagon crackdown from one of their own former employees, Pete Hegseth, who had said, go with the autocratic plan. You have to submit everything for their authorization before you publish it. Fox said no. And the Journal's saying no. And the judges are saying no. It's a lot of no's, even in an environment where people feel like Trump is getting away with stuff. And so we turn, as promised, immediately to James Carville, legendary Democratic strategist, Ragin' Cajun, guy with a pretty good view, heading into the weekend. Welcome back.
Oh, thank you. I'm delighted to be back. Always fun. Friday afternoon, my favorite time to be on the show.
There we go. And I know on the East Coast, people are having their drinks or getting ready for dinner. Let's start with the losing, because you have long said if people don't know about it, it's not going to matter that much. And you got to get the word out. What does it mean to you and to the party that I know you support in fighting Trump, that I just went through a list of losses? And do you get that out to the country? Does that calcify the backbone going into these weekend protests?
Well, a couple of things that we're going to get out to the country because they're going to be stopped getting out of the country. First of all, the Democrats are not going to cave on this budget thing. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't. There is no appetite among Democratic voters to give in. I don't think there's any appetite among Democrats on the Hill, both the House and the Senate. Secondly, we're going to win in Virginia, and we're probably, in all likelihood, going to win in New Jersey. So that is going to change the entire dynamic of the coverage. And I mean, I'm sorry, Senator Thune or Speaker Johnson can go out and do all the talking points they want. You better prepare your caucus for a long haul, because the Democrats feel they're winning this fight. They feel like they're not going to lose it. They feel like they're on the right side, and there is zero appetite to give in. If they wanted to, they couldn't, because Democratic voters come out of the woodwork. You better brace yourself for what's going to happen in November, because this is the first time that voters are going to go to polls, and we've had special elections in every one. The Democrats have outperformed by over 15 points. So the moment of reckoning cometh, and it's not that far away. And now we have the AP University of Chicago poll has Trump at 37%. So I'm sorry, guys, you're hooked up to a loser, and we just have to keep making them pay.
Well, you mentioned the focus on his enemies. John Bolton's a longtime conservative. He's now in the sauce with the rest of them. And this is what he says. I've become the latest target in the Trump weaponizing of the Justice Department. These charges are not just about his focus on me or he mentions his diaries, but the Trump effort to intimidate opponents. Dissent and disagreement are foundational to America's constitutional system, vitally important to our freedom. James, we're in the early days of these cases. We don't know if Trump will win any of them, although they have a huge effect on people's lives, careers, money, even if Trump loses. What do you think of Bolton there?
Well, I mean, Bolton got caught up in it. And, you know, if you get in, you know, your parents tell you, and you hear it all the time, if you lie down with a skunk, you're going to smell bad. And John Bolton made a decision to lie down with a skunk, okay? He understood at some point what he was doing. I suspect that he'll beat this. But all of the other people that were just doing their jobs that are being here, but it's to Trump, all right, it's not about people getting ahead. It's not about people struggling, trying to pay bills. It's not about people wanting an education. It's about getting the people that he doesn't like to use the power of the government to get even with him. And this is not going to work. People want a presidency and they want a government about their lives, and they're not getting that at all. We're getting it about Trump's grievances, and it's going to start paying up. They're going to start paying a price, and we should be the beneficiaries of this.
I want to get you on Zohran Mamdani. We talked about him early on. You talked about his economic message. He squared off in this debate last night. You mentioned Virginia. The election we have is going to be Virginia. There's also New York City. And there are going to be people looking to what this says about the party. Here he was last night.
Well, I'm proud to say that I will freeze the rent for more than 2 million rent-stabilized tenants, and I will also build 200,000 truly affordable homes across the 5 boroughs over the next 10 years. We will have dedicated teams of mental health outreach workers in the top 100 subway stations with the highest levels of the mental health crisis and homelessness. I'm proud to have a comprehensive plan to bring new ideas to this city. If you want more of the same, vote for Andrew Cuomo.
Is he the face of the Democratic Party if he wins this race?
Well, I will say this. I taught communications at the college level, 4 years of community college, 9 years at Tulane, 4 at LSU. If I could have one guess to demonstrate to my students how to communicate, I think I would pick him.
Wow.
That guy stays on message. You cannot get him out of talking about affordability. You notice what he was talking about: rent stabilization, building more houses. He talks about transit, and it's just a real tutorial. And people keep saying, well, you said this about Palestine, and you said this about this, and he just keeps bringing it back to it as the focal point. And Mamdani does something that is very important. He tells people, I see you. I see what your life is. Look, may he not be my ideological, compadre, or maybe some different, but I tell you what, that guy can communicate.
Well, you're
And
not
when
known.
You see somebody can do that.
You're not known as a young leftist.
Who hadn't said stupid things in their 20s?
Okay.
All right, or done stupid things in their 20s. And he's actually, the more I see him, when it started out, I'll be honest with you, I wasn't for him. And a lot of my friends who of my generation, of my persuasion of politics, said, James, you don't get it. This guy's got some talent. He's got some freshness about it. And he's kind of what the city needs.
People out in the streets tomorrow, these are big No Kings protest plans. Your views on the power of this and how it may or may not affect the turnout and what the Democrats are trying to build?
Well, I'm going to get up in the morning. I'm going to go to the supermarket and buy about 4 dozen sandwiches, and I'm going to bring them to the protesters. I think this is the most American, patriotic thing that you can do. And I think this is a wonderful thing that people are sort of taking this in their own hands. I mean, will there be certain people with different ideological agendas there? Yeah, of course there will. But by and large, 90% of this are going to be people that are scared for their country. They're scared to death about the future of the country. They're watching troops on our streets. There's the first time in our history where the payment on the debt is now higher than we spend on defense. And I wholeheartely, and I promise you, all right, I'm not just going to participate in this. I'm going to bring some food. I'm going to bring some stuff. I might even bring a ice chest full of adult beverages there for the people if they want it. But I think what these people are doing is a wonderful thing, and I'm going to find the one closest to me, and I'm going to join them in any way that I can.
Two weeks ago, on September 30th, Colonel Douglas Krugman resigned his post after serving 24 years in the Marine Corps under 4 different presidents. He said he could no longer take an oath to serve under a commander-in-chief who treats the Constitution like a suggestion. Writing, quote, this president acts as though one election makes 236 years of constitutional order irrelevant. Instead of trying to work within the Constitution or to amend it, President Trump is testing how far he can ignore it. If voters and legislators cannot close the gaps in our laws to clarify the limits of presidential power, those who serve our government will continue to struggle. The next president of either party may continue us down this path toward collapse. Joining us now, former Colonel Doug Krugman. Thank you very much for joining us, sir.
Thank you for having me today.
Can you explain? You said you had your title scrapped when you resigned.
If you want to retire and keep your rank for use in retirement on your ID card, on your tombstone, you have to serve either 3 years at that pay grade or receive a waiver from the Secretary of Navy or Secretary of Defense. Had I wanted to keep my rank, I would have had to keep serving until about this time next year. So I voluntarily accepted a symbolic demotion to Lieutenant Colonel in retirement.
That's a lot. Tell me exactly why you felt you could not wait another year. You could not serve out the rest of your service term.
Well, some people start with policy disagreements, but disagreeing with the policy of an administration is perfectly normal for military personnel, perfectly normal for civil servants. The elected president can implement his policies in accordance with the law, and we follow that whether we agree or disagree. Moral issues are more a personal choice based on personal values. And as President Trump's first term ended, and then between his inauguration, his election and his inauguration for a second term, I saw a lot of actions and I heard a lot of rhetoric about things I did not consider moral. And frankly, I wasn't willing to risk my life anymore to serve and defend. And then finally, there's the more concerning threat, which has become much more obvious over the past few weeks, is about actual illegality and illegal orders to the military to conduct actions that they should not be conducting.
We can talk about that aspect in a moment. I want to talk about the morality here. You think that there were clear lines drawn and then clear lines violated in regards to what is a morally right thing to do by a president of the United States. What bothered you so much?
Morality is very much a personal choice. It's shaped by society. It's shaped by religious beliefs. But for me, the pardon on his first day of his second term of the January 6th rioters, insurrectionists, was a moral line for me. The oath is to defend the Constitution. That group of people tried to storm the Capitol. We're chanting for the death of elected leaders, and we're trying to keep our Congress from performing its constitutional role. So his choice on his inauguration day was a first step that week that led to me to decide by that Friday I was going to retire from the military this year.
What about foreign aid?
Foreign aid is, again, personally, I think charity begins at home, but I'd like to see our government echoing that charity. I've seen USAID do a lot of good work in a lot of places, and for a small fraction of the federal budget, saving lives around the world wasn't necessarily a problem for me. I thought that was the morally right thing to do. Obviously, those in power right now disagree. Again, morality is an individual choice, and they made their choice and they made it clear. I'm not entirely sure they did it in accordance with the law. That's another story.
How do you see the president's desire to send in troops or the National Guard to American cities?
I see that as right now a major cause of concern. If you listen to his remarks, you listen to his justifications behind those orders, we've had people, including federal judges, say the rhetoric, the written justifications do not match the actual reality. In the military, there's an assumption when you get orders, they're based on the best information available and that they're legal to execute. In this case, we have orders from the Secretary of Defense, approved by the president, that have been, with governors objecting to them, and now federal judges and authorities saying, no, these should not be executed, in large part because the rhetoric, the justification, is just so disconnected from the reality. It's not factual. That puts our military units in a really bad place. They now have one legal authority who they normally follow telling them to do something for reasons that may or may not be clear to those on the ground, and they have another lawful authority saying, no, don't do that. And the more we have situations like this where units have conflicting orders from two legal authorities, the more we're going to undermine our cohesion of our forces, the unity of our forces, and the strength of our country, because it's going to, military officers aren't supposed to have to choose which set of orders to follow. It's supposed to be clear. And under this administration and their willingness to push the boundary of the law, that's no longer clear in some cases.
Did you see politics infecting individual service members or infecting that cohesion, disrupting that cohesion in a way that it hadn't before over the last 9 months?
I can only speak to my own observations, my own experiences, and frankly, I have had no direct role in anything in Portland or Washington, D.C., and I was fairly removed from what happened in Los Angeles as well. So I really can't speak to any individual or personal reactions to those other than my own opinions on both morality and what I'm seeing from the courts on legality.
You say that you've been a little bit, bothered is not the right word, but you found it telling that people have called you courageous for posting this op-ed, for resigning your post.
The fact I'm courageous for retiring and more so for speaking out is a concern, because the First Amendment that many of us have swore our lives to defend and the president has sworn to uphold as well guarantees us the right of free speech. And if our senior government officials have made very clear comments that indicate there's possible retribution for free speech, And that's spreading fear around our country. Fear is contagious, but also I think courage is contagious. And right now, if there are those real threats of retribution, if there are at least real fears of retribution for the rhetoric, then I think right now we need more people to stand up, and we need more people to make clear that this is not acceptable, and that every American, whether you agree with them or not, has their right to peacefully execute their First Amendment rights, whether by speaking, whether by writing, or going to a protest on Saturday.
I do want to, just on that note, play a little bit of the president during his speech to military leaders. Same day you resigned, same day he gave that speech, although yours
Same
was
day my
planned.
retirement happened to take effect, I decided in January, the week of his inauguration.
Yeah, sorry, my apologies on that. Let me just play a little bit of what he told generals.
Only in recent decades, I've never walked into a room so silent before. This is very. Don't laugh. Don't laugh. You're not allowed to do that. You know what? Just have a good time. And if you want to applaud, you applaud. And if you want to do anything you want, you can do anything you want. And if you don't like what I'm saying, you can leave the room. Of course, there goes your rank. There goes your future.
Okay, I want to play one other one. This is the one, and I'm sorry I wasn't clear to the control room. I want to play the one about Donald Trump talking about the invasion from within.
Only in recent decades did politicians somehow come to believe that our job is to police the far reaches of Kenya and Somalia, while America is under invasion from within. We're under invasion from within. No different than a foreign enemy, but more difficult in many ways because they don't wear uniforms. At least when they're wearing a uniform, you can take them out. These people don't have uniforms. But we are under invasion from within. We're stopping it very quickly.
Do you think that we're under invasion from within? Do you see what's happening on American streets as insurrection?
There have been limited cases of small-scale violence, which most people peacefully protesting the government also abhor and oppose. I think President Trump said a lot of things in that speech that were questionable. I'll use a couple lines he has used to justify killing people. Talking about boats from Venezuela, he said twice, every boat kills about 25,000 people. And then he talked about stacked up with bags of white powder. That's mostly fentanyl and other drugs too. There is absolutely no way any single boat has killed 25,000 people. And those stacks of white powder, according to his own Coast Guard seizures, according to his DEA, and according to everybody else, they're not fentanyl really at all. They're cocaine. So if he thinks blowing up boatloads of cocaine is going to protect the real threat to American people, I think we had 80,000 Americans die of drug-related deaths last year, more than half because of fentanyl. There's just no connection to reality.
Yeah, and a lot of them, according to the reporting and the accounting from the government, are coming in through the ports of entry, the legal ports of entry. Thank you so much. Doug Krugman, former colonel, served 24 years in the United States Marine Corps. I appreciate your service, sir, and thank you very much for coming on and telling us your story.
Thank you for your time.